Hey everyone, I hope you're doing fantastic today. My name is Emily, and I literally can't believe we're so close to a new year. 2020 has been so slow and yet so fast at the same time. So much has happened, and yet I feel like we've all been paralyzed in one place. So yeah, I hope everyone is doing okay in the final stretch to the end of the year. I hope everyone has had a great reading year in spite of everything. Today I'm going to be talking about the worst books I read in 2020, as well as all the books I DNF'd in 2020. At this point, I figured that the last few books I'm gonna read before the end of the year, they're not gonna be worst book category type reads. So unless I have a massive shock with any of the books I have to read, this is my final list. So let's get right to it. Let's talk about the worst reads of 2020. The first book I'm going to talk about is The Paper Magician by Charlie Holmberg. This book is set in sort of a fantasy Victorian England. It could also be kind of Edwardian, I couldn't really tell. So this version of historical-ish England has magicians in it, and Sione Twill is one such magician who has just graduated from magician school. She is hoping to be a metal magician, but instead she's assigned to be a paper magician and to study under one of the most famous paper magicians. At first she's pretty non-cooperative, but over time she learns to appreciate the art of paper magic. But then one day a figure from her teacher's past comes in and incapacitates him, so she has to go on a journey to save him. So the premise of this book was pretty fascinating. I liked the idea of paper magic, and some scenes of paper magic were actually really elegant. What I didn't like was the everything else. I did not like the characters. I was not a fan of the world building. So in isolation, the idea of different types of magic was fine, but I just really did not like the world building around it. I thought it was fairly thin. I didn't understand what part these magicians play in society necessarily. I didn't understand the hierarchy of these magicians. And also this book failed to immerse me in this setting. So much of this story was so overly modern. Like I have seen too many books that use the Victorian setting but use entirely anachronistic and modern concepts, ideas, and objects. Like many times Sione talks about how she just put on her makeup and put in her barrettes, things which your typical Victorian girl or woman who wanted to be respectable didn't wear. Barrettes weren't even invented at the time. And apart from very explicit anachronisms like that, the way the people behaved in the book, it didn't seem like it belonged to that era. Like, I understand if you're trying to make an assertion that magic in this world has changed how people behave and how society has structured, but then that stuff has to be made clear to me. And also there's kind of a hint at a teacher-student romance, which I was highly uncomfortable with. And also the female villain, her entire origin story was that she was a spurned lover. So yeah, all kinds of romantic tropes I was not cool with. I think I gave this book 1.5 or 2 stars on Goodreads. I really didn't like it. Next up is My Lady Jane by Brody Ashton, Cynthia Hand, and Jodi Meadows. So this book is kind of a parody fantasy version of the story of Lady Jane Grey. So in this world you have Ethians, so people who can change into animals, and that includes, I'm presuming from this book, almost the entire Tudor family. And then you just have normie people. And in this book, Ethians, apart from the royal family, I guess, they're persecuted. And I thought this was sort of an analogy for the Catholic persecution of Protestants initially, but I thought the analogy was just really weird and tortured. And of course this book takes a lot of liberties with history. We have a very different ending with Lady Jane, a very different character trajectory for her. And I went into this like, okay, I'm curious to try a humorous historical retelling or a rejig of history, but this fell really flat with me. Like, the humor just fell so flat for me, and the characters were just a collection of annoying cliches. Like, Jane is one of those girls who reads too much. She always has a book in her face. She's always got a book for this and that. When someone has a problem, she always has a book on hand for it. Edward VI, who named Lady Jane as his heir, he's just an annoying teenager. Maybe that's on purpose. But all these characters were just obnoxious, and not in a good way. Not in a, oh, I'm supposed to be interested in this character and how they develop type of way. I just felt like I had a bunch of awkward slapstick being thrown in my face and a lot of labored Shakespeare references. I didn't get on with this book at all. I think this is the one book this year that I gave 1 star on Goodreads. I will very rarely do that. I will always try and give a book a fair chance and try and see its good qualities. I did not enjoy this one bit. Next up on my list is Wilder Girls by Rory Power. I don't think this book was so much bad as it very much fell short of my expectations. This book is about a group of teenage girls who are at a boarding school which is on an isolated island. A pandemic has struck their entire student body and has killed a lot of their teachers, so they are pretty much fending for themselves. This disease causes them to have various types of deformities and disfigurements, and it can be quite unsettling at times. But the thing is, I didn't feel anything about any of the characters. Somehow, all the characters seemed to be pretty much the same. We didn't know much about them before they came together in the school. And I don't know, I just didn't get on with any of them. I just wasn't invested. The premise was quite interesting, and I think what Rory Power was trying to do was actually quite lofty. But for the hype that this book received, I didn't feel much about it, and that kind of bummed me out because I felt like I should feel more urgency about these people who are having a terrible time. Next on my list is Nevernight by Jay Kristoff. This is another not so much terrible but pretty disappointing read for me. This book is about a girl called Mia Corvera whose entire family has been pretty much wiped out and stripped of its political power, and that happened when she was quite young. She wants to take revenge on the people who destroyed her family, so she decides to enroll at an assassin school out in a very distant location so that she may acquire the skills to do so. Again, this book had an excellent premise, and actually some of the world building was quite layered and quite impressive. But so much about the execution just really left a bad taste in my mouth, like the writing. Jay Kristoff's writing style makes me feel like I'm reading the lyrics of an emo concept album rather than an actual novel. Like, Jay Kristoff is trying to be Gerard Way when he ought to just be telling us a sound, coherent narrative. But his main character is just all kinds of young adult cliches. She's a plain, not like other girls type of girl, and eventually at this assassin school she gets a boob job. Like, she's a teenager and a minor, but Jay Kristoff seems to presume that every girl wants to have larger breasts and that larger breasts are automatically more noticeable to people, but it's justified by saying it's gonna make her a better assassin if she's got larger breasts. And also there were footnotes, and typically I would be okay with footnotes. There were footnotes in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, one of my favorite books of this year. I don't mind that, but they were kind of chatty in a way that disrupted the narrative in a way. They kind of interrupted some of the serious tones in the book. So no, I wasn't very impressed with this book. I am very doubtful about whether I'm gonna return to the series or not. Yeah, I'm not sure. Let me know down below if it's worth it. And the last book on the list of worst books I completed in 2020 is Dangerous Remedy by Kat Dunn. I haven't talked through this book yet on this channel. I finished this book literally a couple weeks ago. This is set in the aftermath of the French Revolution, so during the Reign of Terror. Our main characters are Camille Laroche and her girlfriend Ada. Camille's parents were executed by guillotine, so now she has set out on her own. Camille has a gang of misfits around her, and they are paid to rescue people who have been thrown in the Bastille. But one day the person they rescue is quite unusual, and that leads to a struggle for power between the revolutionaries and the old elites. Now that all sounds really good on paper. You have sapphic characters, gay characters, historical fiction with fantasy, sci-fi elements. But I ended up just really profoundly underwhelmed. I mean, I liked the conspiracies and the plots, and generally I was okay with how they resolved, but I really struggled to care about the characters or their relationships, and I zoned out of this book a ton. That's all I can really say about it. I was bored and uninvested, and that should not be the case when the book sounds this good on paper. Also, I don't think it really helped that I was also reading via audiobook, and the narrator just did everyone's voices the same. So when you do all the voices the same, then I can't tell which character is which and who's talking, and I can't get a sense of each person's character. So yeah, I was very meh about this book. I gave it 2.5 stars on Goodreads. So those were the worst books that I completed in 2020. Now we're going to go through and talk about all the books that I DNF'd. I don't think there's gonna be much to say about each of them, seeing as I didn't complete them, but we'll see. First off was Hidden Zay by Gregory Maguire of Wicked fame. So this book is supposed to be a retelling, or rather a backstory, for the toy maker who makes the famous Nutcracker from that ballet everyone probably knows. And the setting seemed to vibe with me. I think it was 18th century Germany. So we had a bit of the historical with kind of the fairy tale like. The main character would sort of go in and encounter different characters from fairy tales. But really, I just ended up so bored. I didn't feel like anything was really happening with him after a while. There was not a whole lot of initiating action. I just felt like he was just wandering all over the place. So that was the first book I DNF'd in January. That was a very slumpy month for me. The other book I DNF'd in January was The Beautiful by Renee Audier. This was touted as the book that was going to bring back vampires, and I was pretty excited about this. This takes place in, I think, 1870s New Orleans. The main character is Céline Rousseau. She is a seamstress who has fled from Paris, and she is striking out to make a new living for herself in New Orleans. So I was really excited about this book, but I think I made it about 130 pages in before I gave up. It was really such a struggle to pick up this book and read it because I was honestly so bored. I feel like that's the case for most of these books. I was bored. And it wasn't only that I was bored, I was annoyed with a lot of aspects of this book. First of all, I felt like the setting of the 1870s didn't play much into this story. Like, if you're not going to have a setting play a part in a story, I'm just kind of like, why make it historical? Why not make it modern? And Céline herself was just one of those modern girls put into a historical setting. I didn't feel like she belonged in that era. I felt like she was just overly spunky. Like, people want to make historical heroines overly spunky and standing up for herself, and I'm like, well, that's all good and well, but you have to integrate that with the setting. And so we had a couple of handsome male characters that were introduced to us, and she kept going on and on about how one of them seemed like the devil and he was like Lucifer, and I found it so obnoxious. So yeah, this book made me go through a massive reading slump. I don't know if it's worth going back to ever. Life is short, you know. The next book I DNF'd was The Merciful Crow by Margaret Owen. This takes place in a society where everyone is divided into different sects, which are symbolized by different birds. So you have peacocks and swans and doves, and our main character is from the crow sect, which is relegated to doing a lot of people's dirty work. I forget if their job is to collect dead bodies or to bury dead bodies. But one day, Fi, the main character, she and her family find that the corpses that they have collected are not dead at all. They are the prince of this land. And that initiates a lot of political and fantasy intrigue. I did make it about 120 pages into this book, and I was very uninvested in the characters. Yeah, I just really wasn't attached to the story at all, and there were other books I wanted to read at the time, so I DNF'd it. The next book I DNF'd was The Vine Witch by Luann G. Smith. This was on Kindle Unlimited, and the Kindle website was sort of pushing this at me, and I was like, okay, I'll give it a shot. So this book I think is set in the 1910s, I think. We have a witch whose family runs a really famous vineyard, and the family uses magic to make the vineyard thrive. But the novel begins with her coming out of a curse that turned her into a frog, and so was unable to maintain this vineyard. And she finds that a very handsome stranger has bought the vineyard instead. So the story is basically about her romance with this person and also taking revenge on the person who turned her into a frog. Like, those things sound fine. I just couldn't take it with the writing style. I just couldn't get immersed in the historical setting at all. Like, the main male love interest talked about his ex or something, which is not something you would say in that era. Like, the whole thing just felt very rom-com-y, and I couldn't take it anymore. And again, there were other books I wanted to read a lot more. And the last of my DNFs was Circle of Shadows by Evelyn Skye. So the main character of this book, Sora, is a trained warrior for her monarch, who is a very famous queen. She and her fighting partner Damon, they come across a group of suspicious looking soldiers one day, and they decide to infiltrate that group, and in doing so get themselves involved in a lot of political intrigue. I already wasn't really interested in this book when I picked it up, so I decided I'd give it like 20 pages or so and decide whether I wanted to continue. And I read the first 20 pages and I wasn't really engaged with the story. World building wise, there wasn't really anything wrong with it. Generally wasn't really anything wrong with it, but I wasn't that invested, so I decided not to continue. There are other books I want to read a lot more. Hopefully I can eventually give this to a person who will appreciate it better. So that is it for my worst and most disappointing books of 2020, as well as my DNFs. Let me know down below, what were your worst reads of 2020? What books did you DNF? If I do not see you in another video before the end of 2020, have a great new year. Let's hope for a better year ahead. Like this video if you liked it, and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in my next video.